Chapters 25 and 26 of Adrift in New York. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gage. Adrift in New York by Horatio Alger, Jr. Chapter 25. Finding the Clue. Tim Bolton looked at Florence in undisguised astonishment. "Dodger?" he repeated. "How should I know? I supposed that you had lured him away from me." "He didn't like the business you were in. He preferred to make a living in some other way." "Then why do you ask me where he is?" "Because he did not come home last night. Sure, he rooms at my house," put in Mrs. O'Keefe, "and he hasn't showed up since." "And you thought I might have got hold of him?" said Bolton, inquiringly. "Then you are mistaken. I haven't seen the boy for weeks." Tim Bolton spoke so straightforwardly that there was no chance to doubt his word. "When he was living with you, Mr. Bolton," continued Florence, "did he ever stay away like this?" "No," answered Bolton. "Dodger was always very regular about coming home." "Then something must have happened to him," said Florence, anxiously. "He might have got run in," suggested the apple woman. "Some of them cops is mighty officious." "Dodger would never do anything to deserve arrest," Florence said, quickly. "True for you, Florence, but some innercent parties are nabbed. I know of one young man who was standin' on a straight corner waitin' for the cars, when a cop came up and arrested him for disorderly conduct." "But that is shameful!" said Florence, indignantly. "True for you, my dear. We might go round to the police headquarters and inquire if the boy's been run in." "What do you think, Mr. Bolton?" asked Florence. Tim Bolton seemed busy thinking. Finally he brought down his hand forcibly on the bar, and said, "I begin to see through it." Florence did not speak, but she fixed an eager look of inquiry on the face of the saloon keeper. "I believe Curtis Waring is at the bottom of this," he said. "My cousin!" exclaimed Florence, in astonishment. "Yes, your cousin, Miss Linden." "But what can he have against poor Dodger? Is it because the boy has taken my part and is a friend to me?" "He wouldn't like him any better on account of that, but he has another and a more powerful reason." "Would you mind telling me what it is? I cannot conceive what it can be." "At present," answered Bolton, cautiously, "I prefer to say nothing on the subject. I will only say that the boy's disappearance interferes with my plans, and I will see if I can't find out what has become of him." "If you only will, Mr. Bolton, I shall be so grateful. I am afraid I have misjudged you. I thought you were an enemy of Dodger's." "Then you were mistaken. I have had the boy with me since he was a kid, and though I've been rough with him at times maybe, I like him, and I may sometime have a chance to show him that old Tim Bolton is one of his best friends." "I will believe it now, Mr. Bolton," said Florence, impulsively, holding out her hand to the burly saloon keeper. He was surprised, but it was evident that he was pleased also, and he took the little hand respectfully in his own ample palm, and pressed it in a friendly manner. "There's one thing more I want you to believe, Miss Linden," he said, "and that is, that I am your friend also." "Thank you, Mr. Bolton. And now let us all work together to find Dodger." "You can count on me, Miss Linden. If you'll tell me where you live, I'll send or bring you any news I may hear." "I live with Mrs. O'Keefe, my good friend, here." "I haven't my cyard with me, Tim," said the apple woman, "but I'll give you my straight in number. You know my place of business?" "Yes." "If you come to me there, I'll let Florence know whatever you tell me. She is not always at home." The two went away relieved in mind, for, helpless and bewildered as they were, they felt that Tim Bolton would make a valuable ally. When they had gone, Tim turned to Hooker and Briggs, who were lounging at a table, waiting for some generous customer to invite them to the bar. "Boys," said Tim, "has either of you seen anything of Dodger lately?" "No," answered the two in unison. "Have you heard anything of him?" "I heard that he was baggage smashing down by the steamboat landings," said Hooker. "Go down there, both of you, and see if you can see or hear anything of him." "All right, Tim." And the two left the saloon and took a westerly route toward the North River piers. 3 hours later they returned. "Have you heard anything?" asked Bolton. "Did you see Dodger?" "No, we didn't see him." "But you heard something?" "Yes, we found a boy, a friend of his, that said the last he saw of Dodger was last evenin'." "Where did he see him?" "Near the pier of the Albany boats." "What was he doing?" "Carryin' a valise for a man." "What kind of a man? How did he look?" "He had gray hair and gray whiskers." Tim was puzzled by the description. If, as he suspected, Curtis were concerned in the abduction, this man could not have been he. The man was a passenger by the Albany boat, I suppose. No, that was what looked queer. Before the Albany boat came in, the man was lyin' round with his valise, and the boy thought he was goin' off somewhere. But when the boat came in he just mixed in with the passengers, and came up to the entrance of the pier. 2 boys asked to carry his valise, but he shook his head till Dodger came round, and he engaged him right off." Tim Bolton nodded knowingly. "It was a plan," he said. "The man wanted to get hold of Dodger. What puzzles me is that you said he was an old man. His hair and beard were gray." "And Curtis has no beard, and his hair is black." "But the boy said he didn't look like an old man except the hair. He walked off like a young man." Tim Bolton's face lighted up with sudden intelligence. "I'll bet a hat it was Curtis in disguise," he soliloquized. "That's all we could find out, Mr. Bolton," said Briggs, with another longing look at the bar. "It is enough. You have earned your whiskey. Walk up, gentlemen." Hooker and Briggs needed no second invitation. "Will either of you take a note from me to Mrs. O'Keefe? For another drink, of course." "I will, Tim," said Hooker, eagerly. "No, take me, Mr. Bolton," entreated Briggs. "You can both go," said Tim, generously. "Wait a minute, and I'll have it ready for you." He found a half sheet of note paper, and scribbled on it this message: "Mrs. O'Keefe, tell Miss Linden that I have a clue. I am almost certain her cousin has got away with Dodger. He won't hurt him, but he will get him out of the city. When I hear more I will write. T. Bolton." Chapter 26. Bolton Makes a Discovery. "I see it all," Bolton said to himself, thoughtfully. "Curtis Waring is afraid of the boy and of me. He's circumvented me neatly, and the game is his. So far my little plan is dished. I must find out for certain whether he's had anything to do with gettin' Dodger out of the way. And then, Tim Bolton, you must set your wits to work to spoil his little game." Bolton succeeded in securing the services of a young man who had experience at tending bar, and about 8 o'clock, after donning his best attire, he hailed a Fourth Avenue surface car and got aboard. Getting out at the proper street, he made his way to Madison Avenue, and ascended the steps of John Linden's residence. The door was opened by Jane, who eyed the visitor with no friendly glance. "What do you want?" she asked, in a hostile tone. "Is Mr. Waring at home?" "I don't know." "Is Miss Florence at home?" "Do you know her?" she asked. "Yes, I'm a friend of hers." Jane evidently thought that Florence must have made some queer friends. "Have you seen her lately?" she asked, eagerly. "I saw her to-day." "Is she well?" "Yes, she is well, but she is in trouble." Does she need any money?" "No, it isn't that. The boy Dodger has disappeared, and she is afraid something has happened to him." "Oh, I am so sorry. He was a good friend of Miss Florence." "I see you know him. I'm trying to help him and her." "But you asked for Mr. Waring," said Jane, suspiciously. "So I did. Shall I tell you why?" "I wish you would." "I think he has something to do with gettin' Dodger out of the way, and I'm goin' to try to find out." "He won't tell you." "You don't understand. I shall make him think I am on his side. Was he at home last night?" "He went away at dinner time, and he didn't come home till after 12. I ought to know, for he forgot his latchkey, and I had to get up and let him in. I won't do it again. I'll let him stay out first." "I see. He was with Dodger, no doubt. Did you say he was in?" "No, sir, but he will be in directly. Won't you step into the library?" "Shall I meet the old gentleman there?" asked Bolton, in a tone of hesitation. "No, he goes up to his chamber directly after dinner." "How is he?" "I think he's failing." "I hope there is no immediate danger," said Bolton, anxiously. "No, but he's worrying about Miss Florence. It's my belief that if she were at home he'd live a good while." "Doesn't he ask for her?" "Mr. Curtis tells him she'll come round soon if he'll only be firm. I don't see, for my part, why Mr. Linden wants her to marry such a disagreeable man. There's plenty better husbands she could get. Come in, sir, and I'll tell him as soon as he comes in. Shall you see Miss Florence soon?" "I think so." "Then tell her not to give up. Things will come right some time." "I'll tell her." Bolton was ushered into the library, where, amid the fashionable furniture, he looked quite out of place. He did not feel so, however, for he drew a cigar out of his pocket, and, lighting it nonchalantly, leaned back in a luxurious armchair and began to smoke. "Curtis Waring is well fixed, that's a fact," he soliloquized. "I suppose he is the master here, for the old man isn't likely to interfere. Still, he will like it better when his uncle is out of the way." He had to wait but 15 minutes in solitude, for at the end of that time Curtis Waring appeared. He paused on the threshold, and frowned when he saw who it was that awaited him. "Jane told me that a gentleman was waiting to see me." "Well, she was right." "And you, I suppose, are the gentleman?" said Curtis in a sneering tone. "Yes, I am the gentleman," remarked Bolton, coolly. "I am not in the habit of receiving visits from gentlemen of your class. However, I suppose you have an object in calling." "It shall go hard with me if I don't pay you for your sneers some day," thought Bolton, but he remained outwardly unruffled. "Well," he answered, "I can't say that I have any particular business to see you about. I saw your cousin recently." "Florence?" asked Curtis, eagerly. "Yes." "What did she say? Did you speak with her?" "Yes. She doesn't seem any more willin' to marry you." Curtis Waring frowned. "She is a foolish girl," he said. "She doesn't know her own mind." "She looks to me like a gal that knows her own mind particularly well." "Pshaw! What can you know about it?" "Then you really expect to marry her some time, Mr. Waring?" "Certainly I do." "And to inherit your uncle's fortune?" "Of course. Why not?" "I was thinkin' of the boy." "The boy is dead." "What!" exclaimed Bolton, jumping to his feet in irresistible excitement. "Don't be a fool. Wait until I finish my sentence. He is dead so far as his prospects are concerned. Who is there that can identify him with the lost child of John Linden?" "I can." "Yes, if any one would believe you. However, it is for your interest to keep silent." "That is just what I want to know. I suppose you can make it for my interest." "Yes, and will, after I get the property. I don't believe in counting my chickens before they are hatched." "Of course you know that the boy has left me?" said Bolton. "Yes," answered Curtis, indifferently. "He is with my cousin, I believe." "Yes, and through her I can learn where he is, and get hold of him if I desire." A cynical smile played over the face of Curtis Waring. "Do you propose to get him back?" he asked, shrugging his shoulders. "I am right," thought Bolton, shrewdly. From his manner it is easy to see that Curtis is quite at ease as regards Dodger. He knows where he is. "You asked me what business I came about, Mr. Waring," he said, after a pause. "Yes." "Of course I am devoted to your interests, but is it quite fair to make me wait till you come into your fortune before allowing me anything?" "I think so." "You don't seem to consider that I can bring the boy here, and make him known to your uncle as the son he lost so long ago." "You are quite sure you can bring the boy here?" asked Curtis. "Why not? I have only to go to Florence and ask her to send the boy to me." "You are quite at liberty to do so if you like, Tim Bolton," said Curtis, with a mocking smile. "I am glad, at any rate, that you have shown me what is in your mind. You are very sharp, but you are not quite so sharp as I am." "I don't understand you." "Then I will be more explicit. It's out of your power to make use of the boy against me, because " "Well?" "Because he is not in the city." "Where is he, then?" "Where you are not likely to find him." "If you have killed him " Bolton began, but Curtis interrupted him. "The boy is safe, I will tell you that much," he said. "But for reasons which you can guess, I think it better that he should be out of New York. When the proper time comes, and all is safe, he may come back, but not in time to help you in your cunning plans, Mr. Tim Bolton." "Then I suppose," said Bolton, assuming an air of mortification and discomfiture, "it is no use for me to remain here any longer." "You are quite right. I wish you a pleasant journey home. Give my love to Florence when you see her." "That man is a fiend," soliloquized Bolton, as he walked back leisurely to his place of business. "Let me get hold of Dodger, and I will foil him yet." End of chapters 25 and 26. '28 of Adrift in New York. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gage. Adrift in New York by Horatio Alger, Jr. Chapter 27. Dodger Strikes Luck. When Dodger landed in San Francisco, in spite of the fact that he had made the journey against his will, he felt a natural exhilaration and pleasure in the new and striking circumstances and scenes in which he found himself placed. It was in the year 1877, and the city was by no means what it is now. Yet it probably contained not far from 200,000 people, lively, earnest, enterprising. All seemed busy and hopeful, and Dodger caught the contagion. As he walked with the reporter to a modest hotel, where rates were $1.50 a day, not far from Montgomery Street, Randolph Leslie asked, "How do you like San Francisco thus far, Arthur?" It will be remembered that Dodger, feeling that the name by which he had hitherto been known was hardly likely to recommend him, adopted the one given him by Curtis Waring. "I think I shall like it ever so much," answered Dodger. "Everybody seems to be wide awake." "Do you think you will like it better than New York?" "I think a poor boy will have more of a chance of making a living here. In New York I was too well known. If I got a place anywhere, some one would recognize me as Tim Bolton's boy, accustomed to 10 bar, or some gentleman would remember that he had bought papers of me. Here nobody knows me, and I can start fair." "There is a great deal in what you say," returned Leslie. "What do you think of trying to do?" "First of all, I will write a letter to Florence, and tell her I am all right. How long does it take a letter to go from here to New York?" "About 7 days." "And it took us over 4 months. That seems wonderful." "Yes, there is a great difference between coming by sea around Cape Horn and speeding across the country on an express train." "If I could only know how Florence is getting along," Dodger said, anxiously. "I suppose she thinks I am dead." "You forget the letter you gave to the vessel we spoke off the coast of Brazil." "Yes, but do you think it went straight?" "The chances are in favor of it. However, your idea is a good one. Write by all means, and then we will discuss future plans." "What are your plans, Mr. Leslie?" "I shall try to secure a reporter's berth on one of the daily papers, the Call or Chronicle. I will wait a few days, however, as I have a few $100 by me, and can afford to take a little time to look around." "I wish I were as well provided, but I have less than $25. "Don't worry about that, Arthur," said Randolph, laying his hand affectionately on the boy's shoulder. "I shall not allow you to want." "Thank you, Mr. Leslie," said Dodger, gratefully. "It's something new to me to have a friend like you. But I don't want to be any expense to you. I am large enough and strong enough to earn my own living." "True, and I feel you will have a chance in this enterprising city." They bought copies of the day's papers, and Dodger looked eagerly over the advertising columns. At length he saw an advertisement that read as follows: "Wanted, a young man of 18 or 20, to assist in the office of a local express. Inquire at No. Street." "Do you think I would answer for such a place?" he asked. "I don't see why not. At any rate, nothing venture, nothing gain. You may as well go around and inquire. And by the way, as your suit is rather shabby, let me lend you one of mine. We are of nearly the same size." "Thank you, Mr. Leslie." "Fine feathers make fine birds, you know, and a neat dress always increases the chances of an applicant for employment, though when it is carried too far it is apt to excite suspicion. I remember a friend of mine advertised for a bookkeeper. Among the applicants was a young man wearing a $60 suit, a ruffled shirt, a handsome gold watch, and a diamond pin. He was a man of taste, and he was strongly impressed with the young man's elegant appearance. So largely upon the strength of these he engaged him, and in less than 6 months discovered that he had been swindled to the extent of $800 by his aesthetic bookkeeper." "Then I will leave my diamond pin at home," said Dodger, smiling. "Suppose they ask me for recommendations?" "I will go with you and endorse you. I happen to know 1 or 2 prominent gentlemen in San Francisco, among them the president of a bank, and I presume my endorsement will be sufficient." Dodger went back to the hotel, put on a suit of Mr. Leslie's, got his boots blacked, and then, in company with the young reporter, went to the express office. "I'm afraid some one will have been engaged already," said the reporter, "but if not, your chances will be good." They entered a good-sized office on a prominent street, and Dodger inquired for Mr. Tucker. A small man of about 40, keen-eyed and alert, eyed him attentively. "I am Mr. Tucker," he said. "I saw your advertisement for an assistant, Mr. Tucker," said Dodger, modestly. "Have you filled the place?" "Let me see," said Tucker, reflectively. "You are the 9th young man who has applied, but the place is still open." "Then I am afraid you won't want me, as you have rejected so many." "I don't know. How long have you been in the city?" "I only just arrived." "Where from?" "From New York." "Have you any idea of going to the mines when you get money enough?" "I think I would prefer to remain in the city." "Good. How is your education?" "I have never been to college," answered Dodger, with a smile. "Good. I don't care for your college men. I am a practical man myself." I am a poor scholar, but Mr. Leslie tells me I write a fair hand." "Let me see a specimen of your writing." Now Dodger had taken special pains on the voyage to improve his penmanship, with excellent results. So it happened that the specimen which he furnished had the good fortune to please Mr. Tucker. "Good!" he said. "You will, a part of the time, be taking orders. Your handwriting is plain and will do. Never mind about Latin and Greek. You won't need it. Chinese would be more serviceable to you here. When can you go to work?" "To-morrow morning. To-day, if necessary," answered Dodger, promptly. Mr. Tucker seemed pleased with his answer. "To-morrow morning let it be, then. Hours are from 8 in the morning till 6 at night." "Very well, sir. Your wages will be $15 a week. How will that suit you?" Dodger wanted to indulge in a loud whoop of exultation, for $15 was beyond his wildest hopes. But he was too politic to express his delight, so he contented himself with saying, "I shall be quite satisfied with that." "Oh, by the way, I suppose I ought to have some reference," said Mr. Tucker, "though as a general thing I judge a good deal by outward appearance." "I can refer you to my friend, Mr. Leslie, here." "And who will endorse him?" asked the expressman, shrewdly. Leslie smiled. "I see, Mr. Tucker, you are a thorough man of business. I can refer you to Mr. President of the Bank in this city." "That is sufficient, sir. I am sure you would not refer me to him unless you felt satisfied that he would speak favorably of you. I won't, therefore, take the trouble to inquire. Where are you staying?" "At the Pacific Hotel, but we shall take a private apartment within a day or two." As they passed out of the office, Randolph Leslie said, "You've done splendidly, Arthur." "Haven't I? I feel like a millionaire." "As you are to go to work to-morrow, we may as well take up a room at once. It will be cheaper." In a short time they had engaged a neat suite of rooms, 2 in number, not far from the Palace Hotel, at $20 per month. The next day, Leslie procured a position on the San Francisco Chronicle at $25 per week. Chapter XXVIII. Florence receives a letter. The discovery, through Tim Bolton, that Curtis Waring had a hand in the disappearance of Dodger, partially relieved the anxiety of Florence, but only partially. He might be detained in captivity, but even that was far better than an accident to life or limb. She knew that he would try to get word to her at the earliest opportunity in order to relieve her fears. But week after week passed, and no tidings came. At length, at the end of 10 weeks, a note came to her, written on a rough sheet of paper, the envelope marked by a foreign stamp. It ran thus: "Dear Florence, I'm sure you have worried over my disappearance. Perhaps you thought I was dead, but I was never better in my life. I am on the ship Columbia, bound for San Francisco, around Cape Horn, and just now, as one of the officers tells me, we are off the coast of Brazil. There is a ship coming north, and we are going to hail her and give her letters to carry home, so I hope these few lines will reach you all right. I suppose I am in for it, and must keep on to San Francisco. But I haven't told you yet how I came here. It was through a trick of your cousin, Curtis Waring. I haven't time to tell you about it, but I was drugged and brought aboard in my sleep. When I woke up I was 40 miles at sea. Don't worry about me, for I have a good friend on board, Mr. Randolph Leslie, who has been a reporter on one of the New York daily papers. He advises me to get something to do in San Francisco, and work till I have earned enough money to get home. He says I can do better there, where I am not known, and can get higher pay. He is giving me lessons every day, and he says I am learning fast. The ship is almost here, and I must stop. Take good care of yourself, and remember me to Mrs. O'Keefe. And I will write you again as soon as I get to San Francisco. Dodger. P.S. Don't let on to Curtis that you have heard from me, or he might try to play me some trick in San Francisco." Florence's face was radiant when she had read the letter. Dodger was alive, well, and in good spirits. The letter arrived during the afternoon, and she put on her street dress at once and went over to the apple stand and read the letter to Mrs. O'Keefe. "Well, well!" ejaculated the apple woman. "So it's that ould thief of the world, Curtis Waring, that has got hold of poor Dodger, just as Tim told us. It seems mighty quare to me that he should want to stale poor Dodger. If it was you, now, I could understand it." "It seems strange to me, too, Mrs. O'Keefe," said Florence, thoughtfully. "I thought it might be because Dodger was my friend, but that doesn't seem to be sufficient explanation. Don't you think we ought to show this letter to Mr. Bolton?" "I was going to suggest that same. If you'll give it to me, Florence, I'll get Mattie to tend my stand, and slip round wid it to Tim's right off." "I will go with you, Mrs. O'Keefe." Mattie, who was playing around the corner, was summoned. "Now, Mattie, just mind the stand, and don't be runnin' away, or them boys will get away wid my whole mornin's profits. Do you hear?" "Yes, mum." "And don't you be eatin' all the while you are here. Here's one apple you can have." And the apple woman carefully picked out one that she considered unsalable. "That's specked, Mrs. O'Keefe," objected Mattie. "And what if it is? Can't you bite out the specks? The rest of the apple is good. You're gettin' mighty particular." Mattie bit a piece out of the sound part of the apple, and when Mrs. O'Keefe was at a safe distance, gave the rest to a lame bootblack, and picked out one of the best apples for her own eating. "Bridget O'Keefe is awful mane wid her apples," soliloquized Mattie, "but I'm too smart for her. Tryin' to pass off one of her old specked apples on me. If I don't take 3 good one I'm a sinner." Arrived at the front of the saloon, Mrs. O'Keefe penetrated the interior and met Tim near the door. "Have you come in for some whiskey, old lady?" asked Tim, in a jesting tone. "I'll take that by and by. Florence is outside, and we've got some news for you." "Won't she come in?" "No, she don't like to be seen in a place like this. She's got a letter from Dodger." "You don't mean it!" ejaculated Tim, with sudden interest. "Where is he?" "Come out and see." "Good afternoon, Miss Linden," said Tim, gallantly. "So you've news from Dodger?" "Yes, here is the letter." Bolton read it through attentively. "Curtis is smart," he said, as he handed it back. "He couldn't have thought of a better plan for getting rid of the boy. It will take several months for him to reach 'Frisco, and after that he can't get back, for he won't have any money. Dodger says he will try to save money enough to pay his way back. It will take him a good while. It doesn't take long to come back by cars, does it? No, but it costs a great deal of money. Why, it may take Dodger a year to earn enough to pay his way back on the railroad." "A year!" exclaimed Florence, in genuine dismay. "A year, in addition to the time it takes to go out there. Where will we all be at the end of that time?" "Not in jail, I hope," answered Bolton, jocularly. "I'm afraid your uncle will no longer be in the land of the living." A shadow came over Florence's face. "Poor Uncle John," she said, sadly. "It is terrible to think he may die thinking hardly of me." "Leavin' his whole fortune to Curtis," continued Tim. "That is the least thing that troubles me," said Florence. "A woman's a queer thing," said Tim, shrugging his shoulders. "Here's a fortune of maybe $500,000, and half of it rightfully yours, and you don't give it a thought." "Not compared with the loss of my uncle's affections." "Money is a great deal more practical than affection." "Perhaps so, from your standpoint, Mr. Bolton," said Florence, with dignity. "No offence, miss. When you've lived as long as I, you'll look at things different. Well, I'm glad to hear from the lad. If Curtis had done him any harm, I'd have got even with him if it sent me to jail." A quiet, determined look replaced Tim Bolton's usual expression of easy good humour. He could not have said anything that would have ingratiated him more with Florence. "Thank you, Mr. Bolton," she said, earnestly. "I shall always count upon your help. I believe you are a true friend of Dodger." "And of yours, too, miss." "I believe it," she said, with a smile that quite captivated Tim. "If it would be any satisfaction to you, Miss Florence," he continued, "I'll give Curtis Waring a lickin'. He deserves it for persecutin' you and gettin' you turned out of your uncle's house." "Thank you, Mr. Bolton. It wouldn't be any satisfaction to me to see Curtis injured in any way." "You're too good a Christian, you are, Miss Florence." "I wish I deserved your praise, but I can hardly lay claim to it. Now, Mr. Bolton, tell me what I can do to help Dodger." "I don't see that you can do anything now, as it will be most 3 months before he reaches 'Frisco. You might write to him toward the time he gets there." "I will. Direct to the post office. I think he'll have sense enough to ask for letters." "I wish I could send him some money. I am afraid he will land penniless." "If he lands in good health, you can trust him for makin' a living. A New York boy, brought up as he was, isn't going to starve where there are papers to sell and errands to run. Why, he'll light on his feet in 'Frisco, take my word for it." Florence felt a good deal encouraged by Tim's words of assurance, and she went home with her heart perceptibly lightened. But she was soon to have trials of her own, which for the time being would make her forgetful of Dodger. End of chapters 27 and 28. 9:30 of Adrift in New York. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gage. Adrift in New York by Horatio Alger, Jr. Chapter 29. Mrs. Layton's Party. "Miss Linden," said Mrs. Layton one day in the 4th month of Dodger's absence. "Carrie has perhaps told you that I give a party next Thursday evening." "She told me," answered the governess. "I expected Professor Bouvier to furnish dancing music. In fact, I had engaged him, but I have just received a note stating that he is unwell, and I am left unprovided. It is very inconsiderate on his part," added the lady, in a tone of annoyance. Florence did not reply. She took rather a different view of the professor's letter, and did not care to offend Mrs. Layton. "Under the circumstances," continued the lady, "it has occurred to me that, as you are really quite a nice performer, you might fill his place. I shall be willing to allow you $1 for the evening. What do you say?" Florence felt embarrassed. She shrank from appearing in society in her present separation from her family, yet could think of no good excuse. Noticing her hesitation, Mrs. Layton added, patronizingly, "On second thought, I will pay you $1.50. Professor Bouvier was to have charged $10. And you will be kind enough to come in your best attire. You seem to be well provided with dresses." "Yes, madame, there will be no difficulty on that score." "Nor on any other, I hope. As governess in my family, I think I have a right to command your services." "I will come," said Florence, meekly. She felt that it would not do to refuse after this. As she entered the handsomely decorated rooms on the night of the party, she looked around her nervously, fearing to see some one whom she had known in earlier days. She noticed only one, Percy de Brabazon, whose face lighted up when he saw her, for he had been expecting to see her. She managed to convey a caution by a quiet movement, as it would not be wise for Mrs. Layton to know of their previous acquaintance. But Percy was determined to get an opportunity to speak to her. "Who is that young lady, Aunt Mary?" he asked. "The one standing near the piano." "That is Carrie's governess," answered Mrs. Layton, carelessly. "She seems quite a ladylike person." "Yes, I understand she has seen better days. She is to play for us in the absence of Professor Bouvier." "Will you introduce me, aunt?" "Why?" asked Mrs. Layton, with a searching look. "I should like to inquire about Carrie's progress in her studies," said the cunning Percy. "Oh, certainly," answered the aunt, quite deceived by his words. "Miss Linden," she said, "let me introduce my nephew, Mr. de Brabazon. He wishes to inquire about Carrie's progress in her studies." And the lady sailed off to another part of the room. "I can assure you, Mr. de Brabazon," said Florence, "that my young charge is making excellent progress." "I can easily believe it under your instruction," said Percy. "I am very glad you take such an interest in your cousin," added Florence, with a smile. "It does you great credit." "It's only an excuse, you know, to get a chance to talk with you, Miss Linden. May I say Miss Florence?" "No," answered Florence, decidedly. "It won't do. You must be very formal." "Then tell me how you like teaching." "Very well, indeed." "It must be an awful bore, I think." "I don't think so. Carrie is a warm-hearted, affectionate girl. Besides, she is very bright, and gives me very little trouble." "Don't you think you could take another pupil, Miss Linden?" "A young girl?" "No, a young man. In fact, myself." "What could I teach you, Mr. de Brabazon?" "Lots of things. I am not very sound in spelling and grammar." "What a pity!" answered Florence, with mock seriousness. "I am afraid your aunt would hardly consent to have a boy of your size in the schoolroom." "Then perhaps you could give me some private lessons in the afternoon." "That would not be possible." Just then Mrs. Layton came up. "Well," she said, "what does Miss Linden say of Carrie?" "She has quite satisfied my mind about her," answered Percy, with excusable duplicity. "I think her methods are excellent. I was telling her that I might be able to procure her another pupil." "I have no objection as long as it does not interfere with Carrie's hours. Miss Linden, there is a call for music. Will you go to the piano and play a Strauss waltz?" Florence inclined her head obediently. "Let me escort you to the piano, Miss Linden," said Percy. "Thank you," answered Florence, in a formal tone. For an hour Florence was engaged in playing waltzes, galops, and Landseer's music. Then a lady who was proud of her daughter's proficiency volunteered her services to relieve Florence. "Now you can dance yourself," said Percy, in a low tone. "Will you give me a waltz?" "Not at once. Wait till the second dance." Percy de Brabazon was prompt in presenting himself as soon as permitted, and he led Florence out for a dance. Both were excellent dancers, and attracted general attention. Florence really enjoyed dancing, and forgot for a time that she was only a guest on sufferance, as she moved with rhythmic grace about the handsome rooms. Percy was disposed to prolong the dance, but Florence was cautious. "I think I will rest now, Mr. de Brabazon," she said. "You will favor me again later in the evening?" he pleaded. "I hardly think it will be wise." But when, half an hour later, he asked her again, Florence could not find it in her heart to say no. It would have been wise if she had done so. A pair of jealous eyes was fixed upon her. Miss Emily Carter had for a considerable time tried to fascinate Mr. de Brabazon, whose wealth made him a very desirable match, and she viewed his decided penchant for Florence with alarm and indignation. "To be thrown in the shade by a governess is really too humiliating," she murmured to herself in vexation. "If it were a girl in my own station I should not care so much," and she eyed Florence with marked hostility. "Mamma," she said, "do you see how Mr. de Brabazon is carrying on with Mrs. Layton's governess? Really, I think it very discreditable." Mrs. Carter looked through her gold eyeglasses at the couple. "Is the girl really a governess?" she added. "She is very well dressed." "I don't know where she got her dress, but she is really a governess." "She seems very bold." "So she does." Poor Florence! She was far from deserving their unkindly remarks. "I suppose she is trying to ensnare young de Brabazon," said Emily, spitefully. "People of her class are very artful. Don't you think it would be well to call Mrs. Layton's attention? Percy de Brabazon is her nephew, you know." "True. The suggestion is a good one, Emily." Mrs. Carter was quite as desirous as her daughter of bringing about an alliance with Percy, and she readily agreed to second her plans. She looked about for Mrs. Layton, and took a seat at her side. "Your nephew seems quite attentive to your governess," she commenced. "Indeed! In what way?" "He has danced with her 3 or 4 times, I believe. It looks rather marked." "So it does," said Mrs. Layton. "He is quite inconsiderate." "Oh, well, it is of no great consequence. She is quite stylish for a governess, and doubtless your nephew is taken with her." "That will not suit my views at all," said Mrs. Layton, coldly. "I shall speak to her to morrow." "Pray don't. It really is a matter of small consequence quite natural, in fact." "Leave the matter with me. You have done quite right in mentioning it." At 12 o'clock the next day, when Florence had just completed her lessons with Carrie, Mrs. Layton entered the room. "Please remain a moment, Miss Linden," she said. "I have a few words to say to you." Mrs. Layton's tone was cold and unfriendly, and Florence felt that something unpleasant was coming. Chapter 30. Florence is followed home. "I am listening, madame," said Florence, inclining her head. "I wished to speak to you about last evening, Miss Linden." "I hope my playing was satisfactory, Mrs. Layton. I did my best." "I have no fault to find with your music. It came up to my expectations." "I am glad of that, madame." "I referred, rather, to your behavior, Miss Linden." "I don't understand you, Mrs. Layton," Florence responded, in unaffected surprise. "Please explain." "You danced several times with my nephew, Mr. Percy de Brabazon." "Twice, madame." "I understood it was oftener. However, that is immaterial. You hardly seemed conscious of your position." "What was my position, Mrs. Layton?" asked Florence, quietly, looking her employer in the face. "Well, ahem!" answered Mrs. Layton, a little ill at ease. "You were a hired musician." "Well?" "And you acted as if you were an invited guest." "I am sorry you did not give me instructions as to my conduct," said the governess, coldly. "I should not have danced if I had been aware that it was prohibited." "I am sorry, Miss Linden, that you persist in misunderstanding me. Mr. de Brabazon being in a different social position from yourself, it hardly looked proper that he should have devoted himself to you more than to any other lady." "Did he? I was not aware of it. Don't you think, under the circumstances, that he is the one whom you should take to task? I didn't invite his attentions." "You seemed glad to receive them." "I was. He is undoubtedly a gentleman." "Certainly he is. He is my nephew." "It was not my part to instruct him as to what was proper, surely." "You are very plausible. Miss Linden, I think it right to tell you that your conduct was commented upon by one of my lady guests as unbecoming. However, I will remember, in extenuation, that you are unaccustomed to society, and doubtless erred ignorantly." Florence bowed, but forbore to make any remark. "Do you wish to speak further to me, Mrs. Layton?" "No, I think not." "Then I will bid you good morning." When the governess had left the house, Mrs. Layton asked herself whether in her encounter with her governess the victory rested with her, and she was forced to acknowledge that it was at least a matter of doubt. Miss Linden is a faithful teacher, but she does not appear to appreciate the difference that exists between her and my guests. I think, however, that upon reflection she will see that I am right in my stricture upon her conduct. Florence left the house indignant and mortified. It was something new to her to be regarded as a social inferior, and she felt sure that there were many in Mrs. Layton's position who would have seen no harm in her behavior on the previous evening. 4 days afterward, when Florence entered the Madison Avenue car to ride downtown, she had scarcely reached her seat when an eager voice addressed her. "Miss Linden, how fortunate I am in meeting you!" Florence looked up and saw Mr. de Brabazon sitting nearly opposite her. Though she felt an esteem for him, she was sorry to see him, for, with Mrs. Layton's rebuke fresh in her mind, it could only be a source of embarrassment, and, if discovered, subject her in all probability to a fresh reprimand. "You are kind to say so, Mr. de Brabazon." "Not at all. I hoped I might meet you again soon. What a pleasant time we had at the party!" "I thought so at the time, but the next day I changed my mind." "Why, may I ask?" "Because your aunt, Mrs. Layton, took me to task for dancing with you twice." "Was she so absurd?" ejaculated Percy. "It is not necessarily absurd. She said our social positions were so different that it was unbecoming for me to receive attention from you." "Rubbish!" exclaimed Percy, warmly. "I am afraid I ought not to listen to such strictures upon the words of my employer." "I wish you didn't have to teach." "I can't join you in that wish. I enjoy my work." "But you ought to be relieved from the necessity." "We must accept things as we find them," said Florence, gravely. "There is a way out of it," said Percy, quickly. "You understand me, do you not?" "I think I do, Mr. de Brabazon, and I am grateful to you, but I am afraid it can never be." Percy remained silent. "How far are you going?" asked Florence, uneasily, for she did not care to have her companion learn where she lived. "I intend to get out at 14th Street." "Then I must bid you good afternoon, for we are already at 15th Street." "If I can be of any service to you, I will ride farther." "Thank you," said Florence, hastily, "but it is quite unnecessary." "Then good morning." And Percy descended from the car. In another part of the car sat a young lady, who listened with sensations far from pleasant to the conversation that had taken place between Florence and Mr. de Brabazon. It was Emily Carter, whose jealousy had been excited on the evening of the party. She dropped her veil, fearing to be recognized by Mr. de Brabazon, with whom she was well acquainted. She, too, had intended getting off at 14th Street, but decided to remain longer in the car. "I will find out where that girl lives," she resolved. "Her conduct with Percy de Brabazon is positively disgraceful. She is evidently doing her best to captivate him. I feel that it is due to Mrs. Layton, who would be shocked at the thought of her nephew's making a low alliance, to find out all I can and put her on her guard." She kept her seat, still keeping her veil down, for it was possible that Florence might recognize her, and the car moved steadily onward till it turned into the Bowery. "Where on earth is she leading me?" Miss Carter asked. "I have never been in this neighborhood before. However, it won't do to give up when I am, perhaps, on the verge of some important discoveries." Still the car sped on. Not far from Grand Street Florence left the car, followed, though she was unconscious of it, by her aristocratic fellow passenger. Florence stopped a moment to speak to Mrs. O'Keefe at her apple stand. "So you're through wid your work, Florence. Are you goin' home?" "Yes, Mrs. O'Keefe." "Then I'll go wid you, for I've got a nasty headache, and I'll lay down for an hour." They crossed the street, not noticing the veiled young lady, who followed within earshot and listened to their conversation. At length they reached the tenement house, Florence's humble home, and went in. "I've learned more than I bargained for," said Emily Carter, in malicious exultation. "I am well repaid for coming to this horrid part of the city. I wonder if Mr. de Brabazon knows where his charmer lives. I will see that Mrs. Layton knows, at any rate." End of chapters 29 and 30. 1 and 32 of Adrift in New York. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gage. Adrift in New York by Horatio Alger, Jr. Chapter 31. Florence is Discharged. Mrs. Layton sat in her boudoir with a stern face and tightly compressed lips. Miss Carter had called the previous afternoon and informed her of the astounding discoveries she had made respecting the governess. She rang the bell. "Janet," she said, "when the governess comes you may bring her up here to me." "Yes, ma'am." "She's going to catch it. I wonder what for?" thought Janet, as she noted the grim visage of her employer. So when Florence entered the house, she was told that Mrs. Layton wished to see her at once. "I wonder what's the matter now?" she asked herself. "Has she heard of my meeting her nephew in the car?" When she entered the room, she saw at once that something was wrong. "You wish to see me, Mrs. Layton?" she said. "Yes," answered Mrs. Layton, grimly. "Will you be seated?" Florence sat down a few feet from her employer and waited for an explanation. She certainly was not prepared for Mrs. Layton's first words. "Miss Linden, where do you live?" Florence started, and her face flushed. "I live in the lower part of the city," she answered, with hesitation. "That is not sufficiently definite." "I live at No. 27 Street." "I think that is east of the Bowery." "You are right, madam." "You lodge with an apple woman, do you not?" "I do," answered Florence, calmly. "In a tenement house?" "Yes, madam." "And you actually come from such a squalid home to instruct my daughter?" exclaimed Mrs. Layton, indignantly. "It is a wonder you have not brought some terrible disease into the house." "There has been no case of disease in the humble dwelling in which I make my home. I should be as sorry to expose your daughter to any danger of that kind as you would be to have me." "It is a merciful dispensation of Providence, for which I ought to be truly thankful; but the idea of receiving in my house an inmate of a tenement house! I am truly shocked. Is this apple woman your mother?" "I assure you that she is not," answered Florence, with a smile which she could not repress. "Or your aunt?" "She is in no way related to me. She is an humble friend." "Miss Linden, your tastes must be low to select such a home and such a friend." "The state of my purse had something to do with the selection, and the kindness shown me by Mrs. O'Keefe when I needed a friend will explain my location further." "That is not all. You met in the Madison Avenue car yesterday my nephew, Mr. Percy de Brabazon." "It is coming," thought Florence. "Who could have seen us?" Then aloud, "Yes, madam." "Was it by appointment?" "Do you mean to insult me, Mrs. Layton?" demanded Florence, rising and looking at the lady with flashing eyes. "I never insult anybody," replied Mrs. Layton. "Pray resume your seat." Florence did so. "Then I may assume that it was accidental. You talk together with the freedom of old friends." "You are correctly informed." "You seem to make acquaintances very readily, Miss Linden. It seems singular, to say the least, that after meeting my nephew for a single evening you should become such intimate friends." "You will be surprised, Mrs. Layton, when I say that Mr. de Brabazon and I are old friends. We have met frequently." "Where, in heaven's name?" ejaculated Mrs. Layton. "At my residence." "Good heavens!" exclaimed the scandalized lady. "Does my nephew Percy visit at the house of this apple woman?" "No, madam. He does not know where I live." "Then you will explain your previous statement," said Mrs. Layton, haughtily. "I am at present suffering reversed circumstances. It is but a short time since I was very differently situated." "I won't inquire into your change of circumstances. I feel compelled to perform an unpleasant duty." Florence did not feel called upon to make any reply, but waited for Mrs. Layton to finish speaking. "I shall be obliged to dispense with your services as my daughter's governess. It is quite out of the question for me to employ a person who lives in a tenement house." Florence bowed acquiescence, but she felt very sad. She had become attached to her young charge, and it cost her a pang to part from her. Besides, how was she to supply the income of which this would deprive her? "I bow to your decision, madam," she said, with proud humility. "You will find here the sum that I owe you, with payment for an extra week in lieu of notice." "Thank you. May I bid Carrie good bye, Mrs. Layton?" "It is better not to do so, I think. The more quietly we dissolve our unfortunate connection, the better." Florence's heart swelled, and the tears came to her eyes, but she could not press her request. She was destined, however, to obtain the privilege which Mrs. Layton denied her. Carrie, who had become impatient, came downstairs and burst into the room. "What keeps you so long, Miss Linden?" she said. "Is mamma keeping you?" Florence was silent, leaving the explanations to Mrs. Layton. "Miss Linden has resigned her position as your governess, Carrie." "Miss Linden going away? I won't have her go. What makes you go, Miss Linden?" "Your mamma thinks it best," answered Florence, with moistened eyes. "Well, I don't!" exclaimed Carrie, stamping her foot, angrily. "I won't have any other governess but you." "Carrie, you are behaving very unbecomingly," said her mother. "Will you tell me, mamma, why you are sending Miss Linden away?" "I will tell you some other time." "But I want to know now." "I am very much displeased with you, Carrie." "And I am very much displeased with you, mamma." I do not pretend to defend Carrie, whose conduct was hardly respectful enough to her mother. But with all her faults she had a warm heart, while her mother had always been cold and selfish. "I am getting tired of this," said Mrs. Layton. "Miss Linden, as you are here to day, you may give Carrie the usual lessons. As I shall be out when you get through, I bid you good bye now." "Good bye, Mrs. Layton." Carrie and Florence went to the schoolroom for the last time. Florence gave her young pupil a partial explanation of the cause which had led to her discharge. "What do I care if you live in a poor house, Miss Linden?" said Carrie, impetuously. "I will make mamma take you back." Florence smiled, but she knew that there would be no return for her. When she reached her humble home she had a severe headache and lay down. Mrs. O'Keefe came in later to see her. "And what's the matter with you, Florence?" she asked. "I have a bad headache, Mrs. O'Keefe." "You work too hard, Florence, with your teacher. That is what gives you the headache." "Then I shan't have it again, for I have got through with my teaching." "What's that you say?" "I am discharged. And what's it all about?" Florence explained matters. Mrs. O'Keefe became indignant. "She's a mean trollop, that Mrs. Layton!" she exclaimed, "and I'd like to tell her so to her face. Where does she live?" "It will do no good to interfere, my good friend. She is not willing to receive a governess from a tenement house." "Shure, you used to live in as grand a house as herself." "But I don't now." "Don't mind it too much, mavoureen. You'll soon be gettin' another scholar. Go to sleep now, and you'll sleep the headache away." Florence finally succeeded in following the advice of her humble friend. She resolved to leave till to morrow the cares of the morrow. She had $12, and before that was spent she hoped to be in a position to earn some more. Chapter XXXII. An Exciting Adventure. Dodger soon became accustomed to his duties at Tucker's express office in his new San Francisco home. He found Mr. Tucker an exacting, but not an unreasonable man. He watched his new assistant closely for the first few days, and was quietly taking his measure. At the end of the first week he paid the salary agreed upon, $15. "You have been with me a week, Arthur," he said. "Yes, sir." "And I have been making up my mind about you." "Yes, sir," said Dodger, looking up inquiringly. "I hope you are satisfied with me." "Yes, I think I may say that I am. You don't seem to be afraid of work." "I have always been accustomed to work." "That is well. I was once induced to take the son of a rich man in the place you now occupy. He had never done a stroke of work, having always been at school. He didn't take kindly to work, and seemed afraid that he would be called upon to do more than he had bargained for. One evening I was particularly busy, and asked him to remain an hour overtime. "It will be very inconvenient, Mr. Tucker," said the young man, "as I have an engagement with a friend." He left me to do all the extra work, and I suppose you know what happened the next Saturday evening." "I can guess," returned Dodger, with a smile. "I told him that I thought the duties were too heavy for his constitution, and he had better seek an easier place. Let me see, I kept you an hour and a half overtime last Wednesday." "Yes, sir." "You made no objection, but worked on just as if you liked it." "Yes, sir. I am always willing to stay when you need me." "Good! I shan't forget it." Dodger felt proud of his success, and put away the $15 with a feeling of satisfaction. He had never saved half that sum in the same time before. "Curtis Waring did me a favor when he sent me out here," he reflected. "But as he didn't mean it, I have no occasion to feel grateful." Dodger found that he could live for $8 a week, and he began to lay by $7 a week with the view of securing funds sufficient to take him back to New York. He was in no hurry to leave San Francisco, but he felt that Florence might need a friend. But he found that he was making progress slowly. At that time the price of a first class ticket to New York was $128, besides the expense of sleeping berths, amounting then, as now, to $22 extra. So it looked as if Dodger would be compelled to wait at least 6 months before he should be in a position to set out on the return journey. About this time Dodger received a letter from Florence, in which she spoke of her discharge by Mrs. Layton. "I shall try to obtain another position as teacher," she said, concealing her anxiety. I am sure, in a large city, I can find something to do." But Dodger knew better than she the difficulties that beset the path of an applicant for work, and he could not help feeling anxious for Florence. "If I were only in New York," he said to himself, "I would see that Florence didn't suffer. I will write her to let me know if she is in need, and I will send her some money." About this time he met with an adventure which deserves to be noted. It was about 7 o'clock one evening that he found himself in Mission Street. At a street corner his attention was drawn to a woman poorly dressed, who held by the hand a child of 3. Her clothing was shabby, and her attitude was one of despondency. It was clear that she was ill and in trouble. Dodger possessed quick sympathies, and his own experience made him quick to understand and feel for the troubles of others. Though the woman made no appeal, he felt instinctively that she needed help. "I beg your pardon," he said, with as much deference as if he were addressing one favored by fortune, "but you seem to be in need of help." "God knows I am," said the woman, sadly. "Perhaps I can be of service to you. Will you tell me how?" "Neither I nor my child has tasted food since yesterday." "Well, that can be easily remedied," said Dodger, cheerfully. "There is a restaurant close by. I was about to eat supper. Will you come in with me?" "I am ashamed to impose upon the kindness of a stranger," murmured the woman. "Don't mention it. I shall be very glad of company," said Dodger, heartily. "But you are a poor boy. You may be ill able to afford the expense." "I am not a millionaire," said Dodger, "and I don't see any immediate prospect of my building a place on Nob Hill, where live some of San Francisco's wealthiest citizens, but I am very well supplied with money." "Then I will accept your kind invitation." It was a small restaurant, but neat in its appointments, and, as in most San Francisco restaurants, the prices were remarkably moderate. At an expense of 25 cents each, the three obtained a satisfactory meal. The woman and child both seemed to enjoy it, and Dodger was glad to see that the former became more cheerful as time went on. There was something in the child's face that looked familiar to Dodger. It was a resemblance to some one that he had seen, but he could not for the life of him decide who it was. "How can I ever thank you for your kindness?" said the lady, as she arose from the table. "You don't know what it is to be famished." "Don't I?" asked Dodger. "I have been hungry more than once, without money enough to buy a meal." "You don't look it," she said. "No, for now I have a good place, and am earning a good salary." "Are you a native of San Francisco?" "No, madam. I can't tell you where I was born, for I know little or nothing of my family. I have only been here a short time. I came from New York." "So did I," said the woman, with a sigh. "I wish I were back there again." "How came you to be here? Don't answer me if you prefer not to," Dodger added, hastily. "I have no objection. My husband deserted me, and left me to shift for myself and support my child." "How have you done it?" "By taking in sewing, but that is a hard way of earning money. There are too many poor women who are ready to work for starvation wages, and so we all suffer." "I know that," answered Dodger. "Do you live near here?" The woman mentioned a street near by. "I have one poor back room on the 3rd floor," she explained, "but I should be glad if I were sure to stay there." "Is there any danger of your being ejected?" "I am owing for 2 weeks' rent, and this is the middle of the 3rd week. Unless I can pay up at the end of this week I shall be forced to go out into the streets with my poor child." "How much rent do you pay?" $1 a week." "Then $3 will relieve you for the present?" "Yes, but it might as well be 300," said the woman, bitterly. "Not quite. I can supply you with $3, but 300 would be rather beyond my means." "You are too kind, too generous. I ought not to accept such a liberal gift." "Mamma, I am tired. Take me up in your arms," said the child. "Poor child, he has been on his feet all day," sighed the mother. She tried to lift the child, but her own strength had been undermined by privation, and she was clearly unable to do so. "Let me take him," said Dodger. "Here, little one, jump up." He raised the child easily, and, despite the mother's protest, carried him in his arms. "I will see you home, madam," he said. "I fear the child will be too heavy for you." "I hope not. Why, I could carry a child twice as heavy." They reached the room at last, a poor one, but a welcome repose from the streets. "Don't you ever expect to see your husband again?" asked Dodger. "Can't you compel him to support you?" "I don't know where he is," answered the woman, despondently. "If you will tell me his name, I may come across him some day." "His name," said the woman, "is Curtis Waring." Dodger stared at her, overwhelmed by surprise. End of chapter 32. And 34 of Adrift in New York. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gage. Adrift in New York by Horatio Alger, Jr. Chapter 33. An Important Discovery. "Curtis Waring!" ejaculated Dodger, his face showing intense surprise. "Is that the name of your husband?" "Yes. Is it possible that you know him?" asked the woman, struck by Dodger's tone. "I know a man by that name. I will describe him, and you can tell me whether it is he. He is rather tall, dark hair, sallow complexion, black eyes, and a long, thin nose." "It is like him in every particular. Oh, tell me where he is to be found." "He lives in New York. He is the nephew of a rich man, and is expecting to inherit his wealth. Through his influence, a cousin of his, a young lady, has been driven from home." "Was he afraid she would deprive him of the estate?" "That was partly the reason, but it was partly to revenge himself on her because she would not agree to marry him." "But how could he marry her," exclaimed the unfortunate woman, "when he is already married to me?" "Neither she nor any one of his family or friends knew that he was already married. I don't think it would trouble him much." "But it must be stopped!" she exclaimed wildly. "He is my husband. I shall not give him up to any one else." "So far as Florence is concerned, she is the cousin, she has no wish to deprive you of him. But is it possible that you are attached to a man who has treated you so meanly?" asked Dodger, in surprise. "There was a time when he treated me well, when he appeared to love me," was the murmured reply. "I cannot forget that he is the father of my child." Dodger did not understand the nature of woman, or the mysteries of the female heart, and he evidently thought this poor woman very foolish to cling with such pertinacity to a man like Curtis Waring. "Do you mind telling me how you came to marry him?" he asked. "It was over 4 years ago that I met him in this city," was the reply. "I am a San Francisco girl. I had never been out of California. I was considered pretty then," she added with a remnant of pride, "faded as I am to day." Looking closely in her face, Dodger was ready to believe this. Grief and privation had changed her appearance, but it had not altogether effaced the bloom and beauty of youth. At any rate, he seemed to think so. He was living at the Palace Hotel, and I made his acquaintance at a small social gathering at the house of my uncle. I am an orphan, and was perhaps the more ready to marry on that account. "Did Mr. Waring represent himself as wealthy?" "He said he had expectations from a wealthy relative, but did not mention where he lived." "He told the truth, then." "We married, securing apartments on Kearney Street. We lived together till my child was born, and for 3 months afterward. Then Mr. Waring claimed to be called away from San Francisco on business. He said he might be absent 6 weeks. He left me $100, and urged me to be careful of it, as he was short of money, and needed considerable for the expenses of the journey. He left me, and I have never seen or heard from him since." "Did he tell you where he was going, Mrs. Waring?" "No. He said he would be obliged to visit several places, among others, Colorado, where he claimed to have some mining property. He told me that he hoped to bring back considerable money." "Do you think he meant to stay away altogether?" "I don't know what to think. Well, I lived on patiently, for I had perfect confidence in my husband. I made the money last me 10 weeks instead of 6, but then I found myself penniless." "Did you receive any letters in that time?" "No, and it was that worried me. When at last the money gave out, I began to pawn my things. More than once I was tempted to pawn my wedding ring, but I could not bring my mind to do that. I do not like to think ill of my husband, and was forced, as the only alternative, to conclude that he had met with some accident, perhaps had died. I have not felt certain that this was not so till you told me this evening that you know him." "I can hardly say that I know him well, yet I know him a good deal better than I wish I did. But for him I would not now be in San Francisco." "How is that? Please explain." Dodger told her briefly the story of his abduction. "But what motive could he have in getting you out of New York? I cannot understand." "I don't understand myself, except that I am the friend of Florence." "His cousin?" "Yes." "But why should she be compelled to leave her husband's home?" "Because Curtis Waring made him set his heart upon the match. She had her choice to marry Curtis or to leave the house, and forfeit all chance of the estate. She chose to leave the house. "She ought to know that he has no right to marry," said the poor woman, who, not understanding the dislike of Florence for the man whom she herself loved, feared that she might yet be induced to marry him. "She ought to know, and her uncle ought to know," said Dodger. "Mrs. Waring, I can't see my way clear yet. If I were in New York I would know just what to do. Will you agree to stand by me and help me?" "Yes, I will," answered the woman, earnestly. "I will see you again to-morrow evening. Here is some money to help you along for the present. Good night." Dodger, as he walked away, pondered over the remarkable discovery he had made. It was likely to prove of the utmost importance to Florence. Her uncle's displeasure was wholly based upon her refusal to marry Curtis Waring. But if it should be proved to him that Curtis was already a married man, there would seem no bar to reconciliation. Moreover, and this was particularly satisfactory, it would bring Curtis himself into disfavor. Florence would be reinstated in her rightful place in her uncle's family, and once more be recognized as heiress to at least a portion of his large fortune. This last consideration might not weigh so much with Florence, but Dodger was more practical, and he wished to restore her to the social position which she had lost through the knavery of her cousin. But in San Francisco, at a distance of over 3,000 miles, Dodger felt at a loss how to act. Even if Mr. Linden was informed that his nephew had a wife living in San Francisco, the statement would no doubt be denied by Curtis, who would brand the woman as an impudent adventuress. "The absent are always in the wrong," says a French proverb. At all events, they are very much at a disadvantage, and therefore it seemed imperatively necessary, not only that Dodger, but that Curtis Waring's wife should go to New York to confront the unprincipled man whose schemes had brought sorrow to so many. It was easy to decide what plan was best, but how to carry it out presented a difficulty which seemed insurmountable. The expenses of a journey to New York for Dodger, Mrs. Waring, and her child would not be very far from $500, and where to obtain this money was a problem. Randolph Leslie probably had that sum, but Dodger could not in conscience ask him to lend it, being unable to furnish adequate security or to ensure repayment. "If I could only find a nugget," thought Dodger, knitting his brows, "everything would be easy." But nuggets are rare enough in the gold fields, and still rarer in city streets. He who trusts wholly to luck trusts to a will-o'-the-wisp, and is about as sure of success as one who owns a castle in Spain. The time might come when Dodger, by his own efforts, could accumulate the needed sum, but it would require a year at least, and in that time Mr. Linden would probably be dead. Absorbed and disturbed by these reflections, Dodger walked slowly through the darkened streets, till he heard a stifled cry, and looking up, beheld a sight that startled him. On the sidewalk lay the prostrate figure of a man. Over him, bludgeon in hand, bent a ruffian, whose purpose was only too clearly evident. Chapter 34. Just in Time. Dodger, who was a strong, stout boy, gathered himself up and dashed against the ruffian with such impetuosity that he fell over his intended victim, and the bludgeon fell from his hand. It was the work of an instant to lift it and raise it in a menacing position. The discomfited villain broke into a volley of oaths, and proceeded to pick himself up. He was a brutal-looking fellow, but was no larger than Dodger, who was as tall as the majority of men. "Give me that stick!" he exclaimed, furiously. "Come and take it," returned Dodger, undaunted. The fellow took him at his word, and made a rush at our hero, but a vigorous blow from the bludgeon made him cautious about repeating the attack. "Curse you!" he cried, between his teeth. "I'd like to chaw you up." "I have no doubt you would," answered Dodger, "but I don't think you will. Were you going to rob this man?" "None of your business." "I shall make it my business. You'd better go, or you may be locked up." "Give me that stick, then." "You'll have to do without it." He made another rush, and Dodger struck him such a blow on his arm that he winced with pain. "Now I shall summon the police, and you can do as you please about going." Dodger struck the stick sharply on the sidewalk 3 times, and the ruffian, apprehensive of arrest, ran around the corner just in time to rush into the arms of a policeman. "What has this man been doing?" asked the city guardian, turning to Dodger. "He was about to rob this man." "Is the man hurt?" "Where am I?" asked the prostrate man, in a bewildered tone. I will take care of him if you will take charge of that fellow." "Can you get up, sir?" asked Dodger, bending over the fallen man. The latter answered by struggling to his feet and looking about him in a confused way. "Where am I?" he asked. "What has happened?" "You were attacked by a ruffian. I found you on the sidewalk, with him bending over you with this club in his hand." "He must have followed me. I was imprudent enough to show a well-filled pocketbook in a saloon where I stopped to take a drink. No doubt he planned to relieve me of it." "You have had a narrow escape, sir." "I have no doubt of it. I presume the fellow was ready to take my life if he found it necessary." "I will leave you now, sir, if you think you can manage." "No, stay with me. I feel rather upset." "Where are you staying, sir?" "At the Palace Hotel. Of course you know where that is." "Certainly. Will you take my arm?" "Thank you." Little was said till they found themselves in the sumptuous hotel, which hardly has an equal in America. "Come to my room, young man. I want to speak to you." It was still early in the evening, and Dodger's time was his own. He had no hesitation, therefore, in accepting the stranger's invitation. On the third floor the stranger produced a key and opened the door of a large, handsomely furnished room. "If you have a match, please light the gas." Dodger proceeded to do so, and now, for the first time, obtained a good view of the man he had rescued. He was a man of about the average height, probably not far from 50, dressed in a neat business suit, and looked like a substantial merchant. "Please be seated." Dodger sat down in an easy-chair conveniently near him. "Young man," said the stranger, impressively, "you have done me a great favor." Dodger felt that this was true, and did not disclaim it. "I am very glad I came up just as I did," he said. "How large a sum of money do you think I had about me?" asked his companion. $500. $500? Why, that would be a mere trifle." "It wouldn't be a trifle to me, sir," said Dodger. "Are you poor?" asked the man, earnestly. "I have a good situation that pays me $15 a week, so I ought not to consider myself poor." "Suppose you had a considerable sum of money given you, what would you do with it?" "If I had $500, I should be able to defeat the schemes of a villain and restore a young lady to her rights." "That seems interesting. Tell me the circumstances." Dodger told the story as briefly as he could. He was encouraged to find that the stranger listened to him with attention. "Do you know," he said, reflectively, "you have done for me what I once did for another, a rich man. The case was very similar. I was a poor boy at the time. Do you know what he gave me?" "What was it, sir?" $1. What do you think of that for generosity?" "Well, sir, it wasn't exactly liberal. Did you accept it?" "No. I told him that I didn't wish to inconvenience him." "But I asked you how much money you supposed I had." "I will tell you. In a wallet I have $11,000 in bank notes and securities." "That is a fortune," said Dodger, dazzled at the mention of such a sum. "If I had lost it, I have plenty more, but the most serious peril was to my life. Through your opportune assistance I have escaped without loss. I fully appreciate the magnitude of the service you have done for me. As an evidence of it, please accept these bills." He drew from the roll 2 bills and handed them to Dodger. The boy, glancing at them mechanically, started in amazement. Each bill was for $500. "You have given me $1,000!" he gasped. "I am aware of it. I consider my life worth that at least. James Swinton never fails to pay his debts. But, sir, $1,000! It's no more than you deserve. When I tell my wife, on my return to Chicago, about this affair, she will blame me for not giving you more." "You seem to belong to a liberal family, sir." "I detest meanness, and would rather err on the side of liberality. Now, if agreeable to you, I will order a bottle of champagne, and solace ourselves for this little incident." "Thank you, Mr. Swinton, but I have made up my mind not to drink anything stronger than water. I have tended bar in New York, and what I have seen has given me a dislike for liquor of any kind." "You are a sensible young man. You are right, and I won't urge you. There is my card, and if you ever come to Chicago, call upon me." "I will, sir." When Dodger left the Palace Hotel, he felt that he was a favorite of fortune. It is not always that the money we need is so quickly supplied. He resolved to return to New York as soon as he could manage it, and take with him the wife and child of Curtis Waring. This would cost him about $500, and he would have the same amount left. Mr. Tucker was reluctant to part with Dodger. "You are the best assistant I ever had," he said. "I will pay you $20 a week, if that will induce you to stay." "I would stay if it were not very important for me to return to New York, Mr. Tucker. I do not expect to get a place in New York as good." "If you come back to San Francisco at any time, I will make a place for you." "Thank you, sir." Mrs. Waring was overjoyed when Dodger called upon her and offered to take her back to New York. "I shall see Curtis again," she said. "How can I ever thank you?" But Dodger, though unwilling to disturb her dreams of happiness, thought it exceedingly doubtful if her husband would be equally glad to see her. End of chapters 33 and 34. and 36 of Adrift in New York. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gage. Adrift in New York by Horatio Alger, Jr. Chapter 36. The Darkest Day. When Florence left the employ of Mrs. Layton, she had a few dollars as a reserve fund. As this would not last long, she at once made an effort to obtain employment. She desired another position as governess, and made application in answer to an advertisement. Her ladylike manner evidently impressed the lady to whom she applied. "I suppose you have taught before," she said. "Yes, madam." "In whose family?" "I taught the daughter of Mrs. Layton, of West Street." "I have heard of the lady. Of course you are at liberty to refer to her?" "Yes, madam." But there was a hesitation in her tone that excited surprise. "Very well. I will call upon her and make inquiries. If you will call to morrow morning, I can give you a decisive answer." Florence fervently hoped that this might prove favorable, but was apprehensive, and with good reason, it appeared. When she presented herself the next day, Mrs. Cole said, "I am afraid, Miss Linden, you will not suit me." "May I ask why?" Florence inquired, schooling herself to calmness. "I called on Mrs. Layton," was the answer. "She speaks well of you as a teacher, but she told me some things which make it seem inexpedient to engage you." "What did she say of me?" "That, perhaps, you had better not inquire." "I prefer to know the worst." "She said you encouraged the attentions of her nephew, forgetting the difference in social position, and also that your connections were not of a sort to recommend you. I admit, Miss Linden, that you are very ladylike in appearance, but I can hardly be expected to admit into my house, in the important position of governess to my child, the daughter or niece of an apple woman." "Did Mrs. Layton say that I was related to an apple woman?" "Yes, Miss Linden. I own I was surprised." "It is not true, Mrs. Cole." "You live in the house of such a person, do you not?" "Yes. She is an humble friend of mine, and has been kind to me." "You cannot be very fastidious. However, that is your own affair. I am sorry to disappoint you, Miss Linden, but it will be quite impossible for me to employ you." "Then I will bid you good morning, Mrs. Cole," said Florence, sore at heart. "Good morning. You will, I think, understand my position. If you applied for a position in one of the public schools, I don't think that your residence would be an objection." Florence left the house, sad and despondent. She saw that Mrs. Layton, by her unfriendly representations, would prevent her from getting any opportunity to teach. She must seek some more humble employment. "Well, Florence, did you get a place?" asked Mrs. O'Keefe, as she passed that lady's stand. "No, Mrs. O'Keefe," answered Florence, wearily. "And why not? Did the woman think you didn't know enough?" "She objected to me because I was not living in a fashionable quarter. At least, that was one of her objections." "I'm sure you've got a nate, clane home, and it looks as nate as wax all the time." "It isn't exactly stylish," said Florence, with a faint smile. "You are, at any rate. What does the woman want, I'd like to know?" "She doesn't want me. It seems that Mrs. Layton did not speak very highly of me." "The trollop! I'd like to give her a box on the ear, drat her impudence," said the irate apple woman. "And what will you be doin' now?" "Do you think I can get some sewing to do, Mrs. O'Keefe?" "Yes, Miss Florence. I'll get you some vests to make, but it's hard work, and poor pay." "I must take what I can get," sighed Florence. "I cannot choose." "If you'd only tend an apple stand, Miss Florence. There's Mrs. Brady wants to sell out on account of the rheumatics, and I've got a trifle in the savings bank, enough to buy it. You'd make $1 a day, easy." "It isn't to be thought of, Mrs. O'Keefe. If you will kindly see about getting me some sewing, I will see how I can get along." The result was that Mrs. O'Keefe brought Florence in the course of the day half a dozen vests, for which she was to be paid the munificent sum of 25 cents each. Florence had very little idea of what she was undertaking. She was an expert needlewoman and proved adequate to the work, but with her utmost industry she could only make one vest in a day, and that would barely pay her rent. True, she had some money laid aside on which she could draw, but that would soon be expended, and then what was to become of her? "Sure, I won't let you starve, Florence," said the warm-hearted apple woman. "But, Mrs. O'Keefe, I can't consent to live on you." "And why not? I'm well and strong, and I'm makin' more money than I nade." "I couldn't think of it, though I thank you for your kindness." "Sure, you might write a letter to your uncle, Florence." "He would expect me, in that case, to consent to a marriage with Curtis. You wouldn't advise me to do that?" "No, he's a mane blackguard, and I'd say it to his face." Weeks rolled by, and Florence began to show the effects of hard work and confinement. She grew pale and thin, and her face was habitually sad. She had husbanded her savings as a governess as closely as she could, but in spite of all her economy it dwindled till she had none left. Henceforth she must depend on 25 cents a day, and this seemed well nigh impossible. In this emergency the pawnbroker occurred to her. She had a variety of nice dresses, and she had also a handsome ring, given her by her uncle on her last birthday. This she felt sure must have cost $50. It was a trial to part with it, but there seemed to be no alternative. "If my uncle has withdrawn his affection from me," she said to herself, "why should I scruple to pawn the ring? It is the symbol of a love that no longer exists." So she entered the pawnbroker's, the first that attracted her attention, and held out the ring. "How much will you lend me on this?" she asked, half frightened at finding herself in such a place. The pawnbroker examined it carefully. His practised eye at once detected its value, but it was not professional to admit this. "Rings is a drug in the market, young lady," he said. "I've got more than I know what to do with. I'll give you $4. $4?" repeated Florence in dismay. "Why, it must have cost 50. It was bought in Tiffany's." "You are mistaken, my dear. Did you buy it yourself there?" "No, my uncle gave it to me." "He may have said he paid $50 for it," said the pawnbroker, wagging his head, "but we know better." "But what will you give?" asked Florence, desperately. "I'll give you $5, and not a penny more," said the broker, surveying her distressed face shrewdly. "You can take it or not." What could Florence do? She must have the money, and feared that no other pawnbroker would give her more. "Make out the ticket, then," she said, wearily, with a sigh. This was done, and she left the place, half timid, half ashamed, and wholly discouraged. But the darkest hour is sometimes nearest the dawn. A great, overwhelming surprise awaited her. She had scarcely left the shop when a glad voice cried, "I have found you at last, Florence." She looked up and saw Dodger. But not the old Dodger. She saw a nicely dressed young gentleman, larger than the friend she had parted with 6 months before, with a brighter, more intelligent, and manly look. "Dodger!" she faltered. "Yes, it is Dodger." "Where did you come from?" "From San Francisco. But what have you been doing there?" And Dodger pointed in the direction of the pawnbroker's shop. "I pawned my ring." "Then I shall get it back at once. How much did you get on it?" $5. "Give me the ticket, and go in with me." The pawnbroker was very reluctant to part with the ring, which he made sure would not be reclaimed. But there was no help for it. As they emerged into the street, Dodger said, "I've come back to restore you to your rights, and give Curtis Waring the most disagreeable surprise he ever had. Come home, and I'll tell you all about it. I've struck luck, Florence, and you're going to share it." Chapter 36. Mrs. O'Keefe in a New Role. No time was lost in seeing Bolton, and arranging a plan of campaign. Curtis Waring, nearing the accomplishment of his plans, was far from anticipating impending disaster. His uncle's health had become so poor, and his strength had been so far undermined, that it was thought desirable to employ a sick nurse. An advertisement was inserted in a morning paper, which luckily attracted the attention of Bolton. "You must go, Mrs. O'Keefe," he said to the apple woman. "It is important that we have some one in the house, some friend of Florence and the boy, to watch what is going on." "Bridget O'Keefe is no fool. Leave her to manage." The result was that among a large number of applicants Mrs. O'Keefe was selected by Curtis as Mr. Linden's nurse, as she expressed herself willing to work for $4 a week, while the lowest outside demand was 7. We will now enter the house, in which the last scenes of our story are to take place. Mr. Linden, weak and emaciated, was sitting in an easy chair in his library. "How do you feel this morning, uncle?" asked Curtis, entering the room. "I am very weak, Curtis. I don't think I shall ever be any better." "I have engaged a nurse, uncle, as you desired, and I expect her this morning." "That is well, Curtis. I do not wish to confine you to my bedside." "The nurse is below," said Jane, the servant, entering. "Send her up." Mrs. O'Keefe entered in the sober attire of a nurse. She dropped a curtsy. "Are you the nurse I engaged?" said Curtis. "Yes, sir." "Your name, please." "Mrs. Barnes, sir." "Have you experience as a nurse?" "Plenty, sir." "Uncle, this is Mrs. Barnes, your new nurse. I hope you will find her satisfactory." "She looks like a good woman," said Mr. Linden, feebly. "I think she will suit me." "Indade, sir, I'll try." "Uncle," said Curtis, "I have to go down town. I have some business to attend to. I leave you in the care of Mrs. Barnes." "Sure, I'll take care of him, sir." "Is there anything I can do for you, Mr. Linden?" asked the new nurse, in a tone of sympathy. "Can you minister to a mind diseased?" "I'll take the best care of you, Mr. Linden. But it isn't as if you had a wife or daughter." "Ah, that is a sore thought. I have no wife or daughter, but I have a niece." "And where is she, sir?" "I don't know. I drove her from me by my unkindness. I repent bitterly, but it's now too late." "And why don't you send for her to come home?" "I would gladly do so, but I don't know where she is. Curtis has tried to find her, but in vain. He says she is in Chicago." "And what should take her to Chicago?" "He says she is there as a governess in a family." "By the brow of St. Patrick," thought Mrs. O'Keefe, "if that Curtis isn't a natural born liar!" "I'm sure she'd come back if you'd send for her, sir," she said, aloud. "Do you think so?" asked Linden, eagerly. "I'm sure of it. But I don't know where to send." "I know of a party that would be sure to find her." "Who is it?" "It's a young man. They call him Dodger. If any one can find Miss Florence, he can." "You know my niece's name?" "I have heard it somewhere. From Mr. Waring, I think." "And you think this young man would agree to go to Chicago and find her?" "Yes, sir. I make bold to say he will." "Tell him to go at once. He will need money. In yonder desk you will find a picture of my niece and a roll of bills. Give them to him and send him at once." "Yes, sir, I will. But if you'll take my advice, you won't say anything to Mr. Curtis. He might think it foolish." "True. If your friend succeeds, we'll give Curtis a surprise." "And a mighty disagreeable one, I'll be bound," soliloquized Mrs. O'Keefe. "I think, Mrs. Barnes, I will retire to my chamber, if you will assist me." She assisted Mr. Linden to his room, and then returned to the library. "Mrs. Barnes, there's a young man inquiring for you," said Jane, entering. "Send him in, Jane." The visitor was Dodger, neatly dressed. "How are things going, Mrs. O'Keefe?" he asked. "Splendid, Dodger. Here's some money for you." "What for?" "You're to go to Chicago and bring back Florence." "But she isn't there." "Niver mind. You're to pretend to go." "But that won't take money." "Give it to Florence, then. It's hers by right. Won't we give Curtis a surprise? Where's his wife?" "I have found a comfortable boarding house for her. When had we better carry out this programme? She's very anxious to see her husband." "The more fool she. Kape her at home and out of his sight, or there's no knowin' what he'll do. And Dodger, dear, kape an eye on the apple stand. I mistrust Mrs. Burke that's runnin' it." "I will. Does the old gentleman seem to be very sick?" "He's wake as a rat. Curtis would kill him soon if we didn't interfere. But we'll soon circumvent him, the snake in the grass. Miss Florence will soon come to her own, and Curtis Waring will be out in the cold." "The most I have against him is that he tried to marry Florence when he had a wife already." "He's as bad as they make 'em, Dodger. It won't be my fault if Mr. Linden's eyes are not opened to his wickedness." End of chapters 35 and 36. And 38 of Adrift in New York. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget Gage. Adrift in New York by Horatio Alger, Jr. Chapter 37. The Diplomacy of Mrs. O'Keefe. Mrs. O'Keefe was a warm-hearted woman, and the sad, drawn face of Mr. Linden appealed to her pity. "Why should I let the poor man suffer when I can relieve him?" she asked herself. So the next morning, after Curtis had, according to his custom, gone down town, being in the invalid's sick chamber, she began to act in a mysterious manner. She tiptoed to the door, closed it, and approached Mr. Linden's bedside with the air of one about to unfold a strange story. "Whist now," she said, with a finger on her lips. "What is the matter?" asked the invalid, rather alarmed. "Can you bear a surprise, sir?" "Have you any bad news for me?" "No, it's good news. But you must promise not to tell Curtis." "Is it about Florence? Your messenger can hardly have reached Chicago." "He isn't going there, sir." "But you promised that he should," said Mr. Linden, disturbed. "I'll tell you why, sir. Florence is not in Chicago." I don't understand. You said she was there." "Begging your pardon, sir, it was Curtis that said so, though he knew she was in New York." "But what motive could he have had for thus misrepresenting matters?" "He doesn't want you to take her back." "I can't believe you, Mrs. Barnes. He loves her and wants to marry her." "He couldn't marry her if she consented to take him." "Why not? Mrs. Barnes, you confuse me." "I won't deceive you as he has done. There's rayson in plinty. He's married already." "Is this true?" demanded Mr. Linden, in excitement. "It's true enough. More by token, to-morrow, when he's out, his wife will come here and tell you so herself." "But who are you who seem to know so much about my family?" "I'm a friend of the poor girl you've driven from the house, because she would not marry a rascally spalpeen that's been schemin' to get your property into his hands." "You're a friend of Florence? Where is she?" "She's in my house, and has been there ever since she left home." "Is she well?" "As well as she can be when she's been workin' her fingers to the bone wid sewin' to keep from starvin'." "My God, what have I done?" "You've let Curtis Waring wind you around his little finger. That's what you've done, Mr. Linden." "How soon can I see Florence?" "How soon can you bear it?" "The sooner the better." "Then it'll be to-morrow, I'm thinkin'. That is, if you won't tell Curtis." "No, no, I promise." "I'll manage everything, sir. Don't worry now." Mr. Linden's face lost its anxious look, so that when, later in the day, Curtis looked into the room he was surprised. "My uncle looks better," he said. "Yes, sir," answered the nurse. "I've soothed him like." "Indeed! You seem to be a very accomplished nurse." "Faith, that I am, sir, though it isn't I that should say it." "May I ask how you soothed him?" inquired Curtis, anxiously. "I told him that Miss Florence would soon be home." "I do not think it right to hold out hopes that may prove ill-founded." "I know what I am about, Mr. Curtis." "I dare say you understand your business, Mrs. Barnes, but if my uncle should be disappointed, I am afraid the consequences will be lamentable." "Do you think he'll live long, sir?" Curtis shrugged his shoulders. "It is very hard to tell. My uncle is a very feeble man." "And if he dies? I suppose the property goes to you." "I suppose so." "But where does Florence come in?" "It seems to me, Mrs. Barnes, that you take a good deal of interest in our family affairs," said Curtis, suspiciously. "That's true, sir. Why shouldn't I take an interest in a nice gentleman like you?" Curtis smiled. "I am doing my best to find Florence. Then our marriage will take place, and it matters little to whom the property is left." "But I thought Miss Florence didn't care to marry you." "It is only because she thinks cousins ought not to marry. It's a foolish fancy, and she'll get over it." "True for you, sir. My first husband was my cousin, and we always agreed, barrin' an occasional fight." "I don't think Florence and I will ever fight, Mrs. Barnes." "What surprises me, Mr. Curtis, is that a nice lookin' gentleman like you hasn't been married before." Curtis eyed her keenly, but her face told him nothing. "I never saw one I wanted to marry till my cousin grew up," he said. "I belave in marryin' meself. I was first married at 17." "How long ago was that, Mrs. Barnes?" "It's long ago, Mr. Curtis. I'm an old woman now. I was 35 last birthday." Curtis came near laughing outright, for he suspected, what was true, that the nurse would never see her 50th birthday again. "Then you are just my age," he said. "If I make him laugh he won't suspect nothing," soliloquized the wily nurse. "That's a pretty big lie, even for me." "Sure I look older, Mr. Curtis," she said aloud. "What with the worry of losin' two fond husbands, I look much older than you. Oh, you are very well preserved, Mrs. Barnes." Curtis went into his uncle's chamber. "How are you feeling, uncle?" he asked. "I think I am better. answered Mr. Linden, coldly, for he had not forgotten Mrs. Barnes' revelations. "That is right. Only make an effort, and you will soon be strong again." "I think I may. I may live 10 years to annoy you." "I fervently hope so," said Curtis. But there was a false ring in his voice that his uncle detected. "How do you like the new nurse?" "She is helping me wonderfully. You made a good selection." "I will see that she is soon discharged," Curtis inwardly resolved. "If her being here is to prolong my uncle's life, and keep me still waiting for the estate, I must clear the house of her." "You must not allow her to buoy you up with unfounded hopes. She has been telling you that Florence will soon return." "Yes, she seems convinced of it." "Of course she knows nothing of it. She may return, but I doubt whether she is in Chicago now. I think the family she was with has gone to Europe." "Where did you hear that, Curtis?" asked Mr. Linden, with unwonted sharpness. "I have sources of information which at present I do not care to impart. Rest assured that I'm doing all I can to get her back." "You still want to marry her, Curtis?" "I do, most certainly." "I shall not insist upon it. I should not have done so before." "Have you changed your mind, uncle?" "Yes, I have made a mistake, and I have decided to correct it." "What has come over him?" Curtis asked himself. "Some influence hostile to me has been brought to bear. It must be that nurse. I will quietly dismiss her to morrow, paying her a week's wages, in lieu of warning. She's evidently a meddler." Chapter 38. The Closing Scene. The next day Tim Bolton, dressed in a jaunty style, walked up the steps of the Linden mansion. "Is Mr. Waring at home?" he asked. "No, sir. He has gone down town." "I'll step in and wait for him. Please show me to the library." Jane, who had been taken into confidence by the nurse, showed him at once into the room mentioned. Half an hour later Curtis entered. "How long have you been here, Bolton?" "But a short time. You sent for me?" "I did." "On business?" "Well, yes. Is there anything new?" "Yes, my uncle is failing fast." "Is he likely to die soon?" "I shouldn't be surprised if he died within a week." "I suspect Curtis means to help him." "Well, what has that to do with me?" he asked. "You will step into the property, of course." "There is a little difficulty in the way, which I can overcome with your help." "What is it?" "I can't get him to give up the foolish notion that the boy he lost is still alive." "It happens to be true." "Yes, but he must not know it. Before he dies, I want him to make a new will, revoking all others, leaving all the property to me." "Will he do it?" "I don't know. As long as he thinks the boy is living, I don't believe he will. You see what a drawback that is." "I see. What can I do to improve the situation?" "I want you to sign a paper confessing that you abducted the boy." "At your instigation." "That must not be mentioned. You will go on to say that a year or two later the time is not material he died of typhoid fever. You can say that you did not dare to reveal this before, but do so now, impelled by remorse." "Have you got it written out?" "I can't remember all them words." "Yes, here it is." "All right," said Bolton, taking the paper and tucking it into an inside pocket. "I'll copy it out in my own handwriting. How much are you going to give me for doing this?" $1,000. "Cash?" "I can't do that. I have met with losses at the gambling table, and I don't dare ask money from my uncle at this time. He thinks I am thoroughly steady." "At how much do you value the estate?" "At $400,000. I wormed it out of my uncle's lawyer the other day." "And you expect me to help you to that amount for only $1,000?" $1,000 is a good deal of money." "And so is 400,000. After all, your uncle may not die." "He is sure to." "You seem very confident." "And with good reason. Leave that to me. I promise you, on my honor, to pay you $2,000 when I get the estate." "But what is going to happen to Dodger, the rightful heir?" "Well, let it be $300 a year, then." "Where is he now?" "I don't mind telling you, as it can do no harm. He is in California." "Whew! That was smart. How did you get him there?" "I drugged him, and had him sent on board a ship bound for San Francisco, around Cape Horn. The fact is, I was getting a little suspicious of you, and I wanted to put you beyond the reach of temptation." "You are a clever rascal, Curtis. After all, suppose the prize should slip through your fingers?" "It won't. I have taken every precaution." "When do you want this document?" "Bring it back to me this afternoon, copied and signed. That is all you have to do. I will attend to the rest." While this conversation was going on, there were unseen listeners. Behind a portiere, Mrs. Barnes, the nurse, and John Linden heard every word that was said. "And what do you think now, sir?" whispered Mrs. O'Keefe, to give her real name. "It is terrible. I would not have believed Curtis capable of such a crime. But is it really true, Mrs. Barnes? Is my lost boy alive?" "To be sure he is." "Have you seen him?" "I know him as well as I know you, sir, and better, too." Tell me, is he a good boy? Curtis told me that he might be a criminal." "He might, but he isn't. He's as dacent and honest a boy as iver trod shoe leather. You'll be proud of him, sir." "But he's in California." "He was, but he's got back. You shall see him to day, and Florence, too. Hark, I hear the door bell. They're here now. I think you had better go in and confront Curtis." "I feel weak, Mrs. Barnes. Let me lean on you." "You can do that, and welcome, sir." The nurse pushed aside the portiere, and the two entered the library. Mrs. Barnes rotund and smiling, Mr. Linden gaunt and spectral looking, like one risen from the grave. Curtis eyed the pair with a startled look. "Mrs. Barnes," he said, angrily, "what do you mean by taking my uncle from his bed and bringing him down here? It is as much as his life is worth. You seem unfit for your duties as nurse. You will leave the house to-morrow, and I will engage a substitute." "I shall lave when I get ready, Mr. Curtis Waring," said the nurse, her arms akimbo. "Maybe somebody else will lave the house. Me and Mr. Linden have been behind the curtain for 20 minutes, and he has heard every word you said." Curtis turned livid, and his heart sank. "It's true, Curtis," said John Linden's hollow voice. "I have heard all. It was you who abducted my boy, and have made my life a lonely one all these years. Oh, man, man, how could you have the heart to do it?" Curtis stared at him with parched lips, unable to speak. "Not content with this, you drove from the house my dear niece, Florence. You made me act cruelly toward her. I fear she will not forgive me." But just then the door opened, and Florence, rushing into the room, sank at her uncle's feet. "Oh, uncle," she said, "will you take me back?" "Yes, Florence, never again to leave me." "And who is this?" he asked, fixing his eyes on Dodger, who stood shyly in the doorway. "I'll tell you, sir," said Tim Bolton. "That is your own son, whom I stole away from you when he was a kid, being hired to do it by Curtis Waring." "It's a lie," said Curtis, hoarsely. "Come to me, my boy," said Mr. Linden, with a glad light in his eyes. "At last heaven has heard my prayers," he ejaculated. "We will never be separated. I was ready to die, but now I hope to live for many years. I feel that I have a new lease of life." With a baffled growl, Curtis Waring darted a furious look at the three. "That boy is an impostor," he said. "They are deceiving you." "He is my son. I see his mother's look in his face. As for you, Curtis Waring, my eyes are open at last to your villainy. You deserve nothing at my hands, but I will make some provision for you." There was another surprise. Curtis Waring's deserted wife, brought from California by Dodger, entered the room, leading by the hand a young child. "Oh, Curtis," she said, reproachfully, "how could you leave me? I have come to you, my husband, with our little child." "Be gone, woman," said Curtis, furiously. "I will never receive or recognize you." "Oh, sir," she said, turning to Mr. Linden, "what shall I do?" "Curtis Waring," said Mr. Linden, sternly, "unless you receive this woman and treat her properly, you shall receive nothing from me." "And if I do?" "You will receive an income of $2,000 per year, payable quarterly. Mrs. Waring, you will remain here with your child till your husband provides another home for you." Curtis slunk out of the room, but he was too wise to refuse his uncle's offer. He and his wife are living in Chicago, and he treats her fairly well, fearing that, otherwise, he will lose his income. Mr. Linden looks 10 years younger than he did at the opening of the story. Florence and Dodger, now known as Harvey Linden, live with him. Dodger, under a competent private tutor, is making up the deficiencies in his education. It is early yet to speak of marriage, but it is possible that Florence may marry a cousin, after all. Tim Bolton has turned over a new leaf, given up his saloon, and is carrying on a country hotel within 50 miles of New York. He has $5,000 in the bank, presented by Dodger, with his father's sanction, and is considered quite a reputable citizen. As for Mrs. O'Keefe, she still keeps the apple stand, being unwilling to give it up. But she, too, has a handsome sum in the bank, and calls often upon her two children, as she calls them. In the midst of their prosperity, Florence and Dodger will never forget the time when they were adrift in New York. The End. End of chapters 37 and 38. End of Adrift in New York, by Horatio Alger, Jr.